Hey guys, I hope everyone's doing well. I know that the top of the board is a little bit chopped off. You're really not missing anything. All it says is Chapter 8, the Elf Child, and some of the key points, the key characters, and things like that. So I'm very briefly going to go through Chapter 8 and Chapter 9, just since we talked about it a little bit on Zoom. But, oh, sorry, no we didn't, but the fact that you guys took a quiz on it. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time with Chapter 10 and Chapter 11. But before we do any of that, I do want to introduce a term called dichotomy. And dichotomy is, and the definition's on the board, but I'm going to read it out loud just in case nobody can read my chicken scratch. And it is a division or contrast between two things that are represented as being opposed or entirely different. Okay, so I'm going to read that one more time because you're going to need to know this definition. A division or contrast between two things that are represented as being opposed or entirely different. Okay, and this is a very important term to look at because we're starting to get into the level of human flaws, okay, of sins, all right? And this is an element that we kind of see in Hawthorne's writing with Dr. Heidegger's Experiment, Minister's Black Veil, and Goodman Brown. So before we get there, and I give you your flip grid assignment regarding this, let's do some of the key points for Chapter 8. As I said, I'm going to try to keep this under 15 minutes. So Chapter 8 was predominantly one of your questions from your quiz. Our main players that we have in here, obviously Hester and Pearl, but we've got Governor Bellingham, John Wilson, Dimmesdale, and Chillingsworth, okay? And the thing that's kind of interesting about Dimmesdale and Chillingworth, so remember, Pearl's only 3 years old at this point, but there's been huge changes to Dimmesdale and Chillingsworth characters since then, okay? Hester even notes that Chillingworth's looking a lot darker these days, right? And Dimmesdale's doing this really weird thing, like grasping his heart anytime he's getting upset. Okay, things are a little bit peculiar. They're a little off. So they meet Pearl, and Hester pretty much goes up to Wilson and Bellingham about the problem of Pearl potentially leaving her. And Bellingham has Pearl go talk to Wilson, and Wilson, remember, has this grandfatherly appearance. Kids really like John Wilson, but Pearl's not having any of it. She refuses to sit on his lap. Okay, so she's kind of, again, refusing the Heavenly Father, if you will, to some extent, since she's refusing John Wilson, who's head of the church. And what's even more odd is at the end of this chapter, she reaches out towards Dimmesdale, who is not a favorite amongst the children at all. Okay, so a little bit, honestly, of a dichotomy right there, right in that scenario. Excuse me. One of the things too, when Wilson asks where Pearl comes from, she says the rose bush, right? Which, I mean, in fairness, this is a far cry from the conversation that she was having with Hester earlier. Okay, poor Hester, can you imagine? She's probably like, please don't ask that question. Okay, so at least she's dialing it down that she's coming to a rose bush. But even Wilson and Bellingham think that this is terrible and the child needs to be removed from Hester's care. So, as I said, Hester kind of goes mama bear on Wilson and Bellingham, right? And she asks for Dimmesdale to help her, okay, and to intercede because he is her minister. And he does, okay, and he speaks a little bit more eloquently than Hester, right? He's a lot less emotional than Hester, but we can understand why Hester's emotional. And he ends up fighting so well for her that they allow Hester to keep Pearl. And it's interesting because Hester even says that Pearl keeps her out of trouble, and we see that at the end with Mistress Hibbins. And what's also very interesting about Mistress Hibbins is this is Governor Bellingham's sister, who is later going to be hung for witchcraft. And he's keeping her in his house, even though he knows that she likes to play like with black magic. I mean, she's inviting Hester to go see the black man in the woods, and Hester saying no, she can't do that because of Pearl. So we see Mistress Hibbins kind of as this hypocrisy that Bellingham has, right? He has all this wealth when he shouldn't. He should be living very modestly. He's housing a woman that obviously could be deemed a witch. So a lot of things going on with Bellingham. Chapter 9. A couple of things that I want to address. So this term, the leech, okay, that's the or what the chapter's called, the leech. So back in Puritan times, a leech was a doctor, okay, because actual leeches, what they would do is if you had an infection, they would slap a leech on you and it would suck out the infection. So they started to call doctors leeches, okay, because they usually had them. Now, obviously, there's a double term for this when it comes to Chillingworth, and we'll talk about that with the leech and the patient. But we learned that in this chapter that Roger Chillingworth learned a lot of his craft from the Indians that captured him, all right? And there's several varying viewpoints about Dimmesdale's condition, right? The Puritans think that if Dimmesdale's taken away from this earth, it's because God has deemed him as them being unworthy of having Dimmesdale in their presence. So, this is how highly they think of Dimmesdale. And Dimmesdale saying, no, if I'm being taken out of this world, it's just because I'm no longer worthy to be here. Okay, so he's kind of being humble and so on and so forth. And then there's also several opposing viewpoints, with Chillingworth working with Dimmesdale, right? Dimmesdale says, no, don't use your resources on me. Other people need you. But other people are like, no, give your resources to the minister because we need him, right? So there's a ton of opposing viewpoints here. But what ends up happening is Chillingworth and Dimmesdale become BFFs, right? And the big reason that they're BFFs is because both of them are very scholarly dudes, all right? They're very like-minded in the fact that they're very bookish, okay? They are learned men, so they have really great conversations. I mean, it really sucks that Chillingworth is probably going to go after Dimmesdale, all right? But one of the things that Chillingworth does tell Dimmesdale is this body and mind connection, right? So we're starting to see some elements of Gothic literature start to filter in to Hawthorne's writing, which we didn't really notice as much in his short stories, okay? And as I said, Chillingworth is saying basically that if your mind isn't sound, if there are things going on in the mind that haven't been healed, then your body is going to suffer the consequences of it, okay? Because this is what's going on with Dimmesdale. There's something going on with the body that the people are realizing. So moving into chapter 10, the leech and his patient. So Chillingworth becomes consumed, okay, with figuring out what Dimmesdale's secret is. So he learns in chapter 9, he knows that there is some sort of secret that he's hiding, but he doesn't know what it is. So this just consumes Chillingworth and his character. And we have this very interesting scenario about Chillingworth getting these weeds from the grave, right? And he's going to use it in a potion for Dimmesdale. And Dimmesdale has a lot of questions about these weeds, right? And Chillingworth says that these weeds grew from the heart of a man that's buried in his grave. And they start to have this philosophical conversation about how this happened and why this happens. And Chillingworth says that those weeds that come from the heart are an unconfessed sin. Okay, so he's trying to prompt Dimmesdale to tell him the sin, and he's not getting a whole lot of feedback. And Dimmesdale gives him a reason why a man might die with his sins. And he actually gives some very good reasoning and rationale, right? He uses a lot of good logos here. One of them being that a man would serve his people better by not telling them his sins. Because if they knew, then they probably wouldn't be listening to him anymore, right? So, which again, this kind of makes sense because he sees what's happened to Hester. Hester committed one sin and she's ostracized. He's the minister. So depending on what sin he's harboring, I'm sure everyone can guess what sin he's harboring at this point, okay? He could lose his entire reputation. He wouldn't be a minister anymore. And a minister is supposed to help guide people. So he thinks that if he tells people, he won't be able to guide them anymore. And he thinks that he's doing them such a good service that he shouldn't tell them what's going on. Which is kind of skewed thinking. It's a little bit pompous in my opinion, but who am I to say? So he has this whole... He talks about that, and then the other thing that he talks about with not confessing your sin is this whole minister's black veil thing again, right? That nobody else should know your business except God, that God's the one that's ultimately going to judge you. And we've already heard that song and dance before. So he's giving a lot of good reasons for Chillingworth. But what's kind of interesting, Chillingworth keeps poking at him and poking at him and poking at him. And then we see Pearl and Hester in the graveyard, right? And then Dimmesdale and Chillingworth are watching from the window. And again, Chillingworth keeps on probing Dimmesdale, right? And he even says, do you think Hester is a lot freer with her sin than you are with yours? Okay, don't you think that she's a lot more, or able to live her life more freely? Which to some extent she is, right? Her sin is out there. People know what she is and what she's done, okay? So we actually have these two contrasting ideas that Hester has shame while Dimmesdale has guilt, okay? Because his guilt is from his unconfessed sins. Hester's shame is from her confessed sin, okay? So you see, again, the Dimmesdale's guilt, Hester's shame. But Dimmesdale even says, yeah, you know, she's probably living a better life because she's at least confessed it. And Chillingworth's like, so shouldn't all men confess their sins because then they're going to feel great, right? And Dimmesdale is still recalcitrant about it and refuses. And in fact, he gets so annoyed and mad at Chillingworth and he lashes out at him. He loses his temper. This very subdued and quiet man loses his temper at Chillingworth. And that's when he knows that there is something, right? And then Chillingworth knows that they'll become friends again, so he's not too concerned. But as Dimmesdale's napping, he ends up, which I think is kind of creepy, he opens up his shirt to see if there's anything, because again, remember, he does that really odd thing when he gets upset. He like clutches his chest, so that's where Chillingworth is suspicious that something's lying. So he looks at his shirt and there's something there, okay, because Chillingworth smiles at the end of the chapter, okay, but we don't know what that is. Supposedly, I mean, literary critics say that it's an A that he's kind of cut into his chest. Okay, I don't know. I wasn't there. Okay, so he kind of, again, Hawthorne kind of leaves it to the reader to infer. So chapter 11, we got the interior of a heart. So this is where we see Chillingworth moving to revenge, because now he knows that Dimmesdale's Pearl's dad and that Dimmesdale is the one that slept with Hester. Okay, so again, we see these different sins, okay, these different human flaws attached to these characters. All right, Hester obviously had adultery. Hers would have been lust. Okay, we can say the same for Dimmesdale too, right? He has lust, but now he also has guilt, okay, because he's hiding this sin. Okay, he's kind of dishonest to some extent. But now we've got Chillingworth, okay, and he's being consumed with revenge. He's figured out the secret, and now he's going to be vengeful. And the way that he's going to do this is he is going to cause as much pain to Dimmesdale as he possibly can. He's basically going to torture him to death, which is a pretty rough way to go. What's interesting, though, Dimmesdale starts to become suspicious, too, of Chillingworth, right? He starts to feel worse and worse and worse, and he starts to blame it or think that maybe Chillingworth isn't really helping him. The other thing that's kind of interesting, Dimmesdale's sermons become very popular among Puritan society, okay? Mainly because he's so real, okay? This guy is legit. He talks about real human sin. People can connect with this. This is totally relatable, and it's coming from a minister. So all these people think that he's so humble because he admits to his own sins, okay? And he talks about them. So he starts to gain this sort of following. And supposedly he attempts to confess publicly while he's on the pulpit what he's done, but he can never bring himself to do it. And he keeps saying like he's come close, but he never does say it. So again, is he really trying to fess up, or is he not? We're not quite sure, but he says that he is. So instead of actually confessing, he ends up scourging himself privately. Okay, so basically what that means, that very last paragraph of the book is kind of hard to understand. A lot of the book is difficult to understand, but that part in particular, right? He talks about old Roman times and reverting back to their ways of kind of torture, the kind of scourging, all right? So like whipping himself, he's cutting himself, things like that, fasting. And then when he does this, especially the fasting, he starts to hallucinate, right? He sees angels and things like that. So after one of his scourges, he ends up leaving to go for a walk. And that's where we ended on chapter 11. So we see a lot of character development, okay, in these chapters. Chapter 12 and 13, which you're going to read tonight, you're going to see a lot more about Dimmesdale, because there's a couple of questions that kind of leave us wondering right now about Dimmesdale. Like, we as the audience, should we feel sympathy towards Dimmesdale? I mean, he does make some good points about why he shouldn't confess his sin, but are those reasons really worth him not confessing his sin, especially when poor Hester and his daughter are left holding the bag, his daughter who's considered a bastard child because she doesn't have a dad? So these are some things to think about with Dimmesdale's character. So what you're going to be doing for homework, you are going to be doing a flip grid. I want you to look at this idea of dichotomy, okay, where you see these two opposing things, okay, within the novel. They're mainly going to be like characters or settings. You can look at sins, okay, who has what, okay. There's a lot of places you can go. Please refer to my directions on the discussion board on My St. Mary's, okay. Those will help guide you for this assignment. And we will Zoom tomorrow and talk a little bit more. Hopefully the lecture was quick and painless, and I look forward to seeing your flip grids. Have a good one.